All right, so let's get started. If you aren't familiar with Node.js already, Node.js is a runtime that allows you to use JavaScript as a server-side framework for building applications. So I'm sure you've just visited nodejs.org, gotten it downloaded, and are familiar with the JavaScript environment as well. What we'll be doing today is we'll be building a simple REST API for our mobile app, or that we can use in a mobile app, or that we can use in something else that will allow us to store, that will be a framework for us to, in the future, build a mobile app that allows us to store notes and take notes down and store them in this REST API. So this is based off of a tutorial I wrote a few months ago. If you want to open up the tutorial, if you have internet connectivity, definitely follow this along. You can just search for build REST API for a mobile app. And I think it's the first one up here. So you can see tutorial, build a REST API for your mobile apps using Node.js from stormpath.com. So for this tutorial today, we're going to be using this really popular Node.js framework called Express.js. So if you want to open up the website, the style that I really like to do for this tutorial is just to go through and also look and follow along with some of the documentation that's out there online, so that it's easy for you to envision as you continue to build. How will you look up and how will you find this information for you to continue building your own things? So Express is the most popular web framework and API framework for Node.js. And as you can see here, its motto is it's a fast and unopinionated minimalist web framework for Node.js. So what does that mean? One, it's fast, meaning Node.js is like one of the, compared to PHP, compared to Ruby, compared to Python, it's way faster than most of those languages for building, for both building and for serving your APIs and web pages. It's very unopinionated, which means that it actually allows you to make a lot of your own decisions about how to do things. And so we'll see as we start building our own API service with Node that the unopinionated nature makes it a little more difficult to get started because you have to think about, you have to make some decisions at the starting point of your app. But it's minimalist. So what that means is Express actually doesn't do much. And we'll see that as we start building our Express app as well. But the great thing is, once you start learning the general architecture of how Express works, it makes it very easy to understand what your app is doing and where you should be looking to continue building things for your app. All right. So what we'll start is we're going to start by building our first Express application. And we're going to build it so that we can just get a simple hello world application out there and host that on our local machine. So with Node installed and with Express installed, what I'm going to ask you to do is to open up a terminal. So if you're on Windows, you can open up the start menu and type in CMD, and that should open up a terminal. If you're on Mac, you can type in terminal and open up a terminal. So in here, let's see. In here, what we're going to do, I'm going to change directories really quickly. But we're going to make a directory. And again, I actually don't remember the command on Windows, but on Mac, it's mkdir. OK, it's the same on Windows. So if we say make dir, and we'll just say hello-world, that's going to create a directory for us. Right now, just follow along with these commands. We don't really have to. It's not very important for this tutorial, but we're going to make a directory called hello world. We're going to type in cd hello-world to go into the directory. And we just created a folder for our project. So if you're on Mac, this project, well, you can actually type in open dot to open up the folder that we created for our project. So this is actually a folder on your main hard drive. On Windows, I think you'd have to open up c:/users/my-username/hello-world to get to this. But OK, so we've created a directory. And what we want to do is we want to get started with Node.js, and we want to install Express. So if you actually look, Express actually has some really great documentation on what you can do with it. But under, if you're on their website, you can go to expressjs.com, click on Getting Started. There's a section about installing. Actually, it says, hey, what we can do is we can say, make a directory called my app. We can change directory into my app. And what we'll first do is we're going to run this command called npm init. And so what npm does is npm stands for the Node Package Manager. And npm allows us to manage what sort of external pieces of code we're going to be using in our Node.js applications, and how to install and it helps us install these external dependencies. So if I type in npm init in my directory, it's going to ask us, hey, this utility is going to ask you and walk you through creating a package.json file. So it covers the most common items and tries to guess the sensible defaults. Right now, we don't really have to care too much about all the questions it's going to ask us. But you can see it's going to ask us, hey, what name do you want? OK, I'll say hello-world. What version? I'm just going to press enter through all these commands. Right now, I don't really care. And so what this just did is this initialized a Node.js project for us. And if I look in this directory that we opened up earlier, it creates this one simple file called package.json. And if I open up this file, you can see it pretty much just has the answers to the questions that we just answered. What's the name? What's the version? What's the description? For the most part, this isn't really that useful at this point in time. But what this is going to do in the future is going to allow us to take a look at all of these different packages. And it's going to allow us to take a look at external pieces of code that we're going to install and add to our Node.js app. So everyone follow along at this point. Raise your hand if you have a directory created, you typed in npm init, and you've also answered yes to all of these questions. OK. I'm going to give you about another minute to do so. So if you haven't already, ask one of your neighbors. If you raised your hand just a few seconds ago, raise your hand again. OK, for those, I know more of you have raised your hand a few seconds ago. So raise your hand if you're at this point. OK. If you aren't at this point and are trying to follow along, look around to one of your neighbors and ask them to help you to get to this point.
I know, the Wi-Fi is so strong. Now we're waiting. That's what I did too. But I didn't know one.
The question over there was, will we have to install Express already? Right now, no. We're just using Node Package Manager to initialize a project. We'll add Express in a few seconds. Yeah.
So what's npm port?
Right now, we just created a project by using npm init.
Oh, okay.
So we're doing these first three commands right up here.
Are you on our Node is navigation at
Yep.
Does it take a long time to download?
It depends on the internet speed. So.
I was like, I'm still
No, just it.
Okay.
You can do the setting. I was asking you kind of
All right. How many of you have your Express project or your Node project initialized so far? Raise your hands.
yeah.
OK. So looks like a good number of you. So we'll get started with the next step. And again, these instructions are actually on the Express.js website. So if you're having some internet problems or installation problems, you can go to this website and see how to install Express and get started with it. So right now, what we have done is we created a folder for our project, and we use the command line to do that. We created a folder for a project, and we used the npm init command to create a package.json file. And again, this package.json file really just contains different pieces of information about the web application that you're building. Right now, there's not that much information. We just created a really simple stub file. But what we need to do now is we need to use the Node package manager to now import the Express.js code. Because Express.js, it's a server-side web framework. Node.js is the runtime that allows us to run the code. Express.js is going to be the framework that allows us to actually build this web application. So after npm init, what we'll run is we'll just say npm install express -- save. So we'll run this command in the command line. And you'll see that on my computer, it's starting to download and install these dependencies.
Yeah, you have to use added.
So I'm not sure what the internet speed is like right now.
Very slow.
Oh, yours is fast.
Let's see, no description.
But we have resolved the internet issue. We don't have to format the others.
OK, awesome. Yep.
We have to do this in the same working directory, run the command.
Yeah, we'll have to do this in the same directory where we ran npm init. So right now it's a bit slow. It's still loading some stuff from the network. But what you can see is we're using npm to now install and download and install the Express bit of code. So Express is actually an open source library that you can actually go online on GitHub and take a look at the source code for and see how it's built. So right now it is taking a bit of time. So yep.
So like if you're going to be creating like a lot of projects in the future using Node.js, would you have to manually install whatever like frameworks you want for your certain projects in each folder?
Yeah, so the question is, if you're creating a lot of different projects for Node.js, will you have to install the different frameworks in each folder? And the answer is yes. So that makes sure that your different projects might actually use different versions of the framework. Your different projects might, you might want to upgrade them at different points in time. So that's why you might even want to use different frameworks. So that's why you actually install it for each project.
How would that affect how projects interact with one another? Let's say if one project has like used another one as like in the project itself, like would that cause conflicts because one doesn't have like a framework or dependency and the other one does?
Yeah, so I think it's going to affect it in different ways. But if they're working together, usually like each node will actually nest the dependencies if they're incompatible versions. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
He really likes saying keep fun. Oh, he finds it too. I would. Did you go to You already serious? Yeah. For sure, yeah. Those players just also. How do you do it there? My partner is very easy so hard.
I wonder if you mean the last one.
Yeah, mine helps me out with the last two. I
got all of it until like the last one.
I can't volunteer. You can just be like, oh yeah, it's 2 days. You can be like, oh
Quick question to the audience. Is anyone able to successfully install Express so far? Oh, okay, so it's just my computer then now. All right. It's hanging for me, so maybe I'll just like not be able to show the actual running examples, but I'll at least be able to show you the coding examples. If I'm not sure why it's not installing for me then. Okay. Okay, cool. So let's continue on with this process then. I'm having troubles installing my Express myself, so I won't be able to run the example, but since it seems like most of you have it installed, you'll be able to run the example project. So, okay, great. So we've installed Express now. What we've done so far is we've initialized our project, we've installed Express, and what should have happened is if you look back into your package.json file, now in this package.json file, npm will add this portion that it will look something like dependencies : express like 3 dot whatever, something like that. That basically now pins, hey, what your project has is it has this name, it has this version and everything, but it also now has a dependency on the Express code base. So that's going to allow you and other people to share and make sure that you manage the different pieces of code that you're depending on properly. The other thing that it's going to do is, you can't see it on my computer right now, but it's going to create this node modules directory and install Express into that directory so your project can use it. So what we'll do now is we'll create our first file, and we'll be able to, with that file in our directory, we're going to then initialize our first Express application, and we're going to code against it and build a quick application that will say, hello world, back at you. So how will we do this? Well, Express and Node.js is very unopinionated in general, so it's not going to tell you, hey, here's how to manage your project, here's how to structure your project, here's how to create files in your project. It's not going to do anything. It's not going to make those decisions for you. So we'll have to make those decisions ourselves. So what we can do here is, I'm going to make a decision that we're going to create a file called server.js. And inside server.js is going to live all of our code for our API. So how do we do that? Well, open up your favorite text editor. Open up your favorite text editor, and then you can navigate. You can say new file. You can save this and navigate to that folder that we created. So for me, oh shoot, I put this in a very inconvenient folder. So for me, it's going to be hard to navigate to that folder that I created because I put it in /temp. But for most of you, I think you'll probably have created in the documents folder or in your home directory. So by default, if you followed the instructions from earlier, it would be like in your home directory, and then you probably have a directory right here. In Windows, it will be c:/users/ your username, and then be in the same directory, alongside of your documents or your downloads folder or so on and so forth. So navigate to that point. I'm going to navigate and use the command line since, again, I saved myself in an inconvenient location. All right. Instead, we'll call it server.js. So we'll create a file called server.js. We'll open it up in Sublime. We'll open it up in Visual Studio Code or Atom, whichever your favorite text editor is. And then what we'll do is we'll follow the instructions over here for getting started. So actually, Express has a really great Hello World tutorial if you go to the second part of getting started. So we'll follow this. So you can see the Hello World app for Express is actually really straightforward. It only has a few lines of code. So we'll write each line by line and go through it. And I'll explain what it's doing there. So first line says var express equals to require express. And what this is doing is in Node.js, what this require statement will do is we'll import the Express package that we just installed and set Express, this object, to that package. So whatever the different packages will export their APIs in different ways. But in this case, we'll say var express equals to require express. And now we have this Express object in our project, and we'll be able to use this however we want. The second line that we'll do is we'll say var app is equal to express. Open close parentheses. And so we'll take a look at the Express API in a little bit. But one of the things that it tells us is, hey, if we want to actually create an Express application, we'll have to use Express. We'll have to run this function, and then this will create our own instance of an app that we can use, configure, and now host an application. The third line that we'll do is we'll say app.get. We'll say app.get slash function rec res.send hello world. So this line of code might be a little more interesting for some of you who haven't used JavaScript as much. So we're calling this function app.get. And so app.get is basically saying, let's register a handler at slash. And what are we going to do? We'll say we want to call this function. And in Node.js, we can, or in JavaScript, we can pass a function as a parameter. So we'll say, we're going to register a handler for slash. And we'll call this function, which takes two parameters. One is rec, so that stands for the request. One is res, which stands for the response. And we'll say res.send hello world as a string. And that's the end of the function. So in Node, we can pass these functions. And again, this is a really interesting way. The other thing is we're registering a handler for slash. So some of you might ask, what does slash actually mean? So Randall was talking about APIs in the last talk. But if I go to a website, let's say I go to google.com, right? And if you look at the URL that we're accessing google.com/. Even sometimes we'll say google.com without that slash. We're really talking about it with the slash that's implicitly being added here. But so if we're looking at a URL like https www.google.com, this is really three parts. The first part is https://. That's saying, hey, I want to access this website using HTTPS. The second part we're saying is, I want to access, what website do I want to access? I want to access www.google.com. The third part is, what on the website do I want to access? And so right now, if we just go to the main page for google.com, it's just slash, the empty path. But sometimes that might be google.com/mail. That might be sometimes google.com/analytics. Google.com/. There's a bunch of different services on google.com. And so the portion after google.com, that's this slash that we're talking about. That's this route. That's called a route, or the path of the URL. So we'll say app.get/, and then we want to register this function. So whenever someone's looking for the slash route, we'll run this function. It gets the request, that takes the request, that takes the response, and we'll say, with the response, we'll send hello world. The last thing that we need to do in this hello world example is we'll say app.listen. And what this is going to do is we're going to say with this app, we want to listen on port 3000. And some of you may be asking, what is this port? Why are we saying 3000? So, well, same thing with these URLs. So when we connect to a website like google.com, each host, each server that we connect to will have a number of different ports that you can connect to and establish connections to. By default, connecting to google.com is going to be on port 80. And that's like the default port for websites. It's usually a little harder to get ports set up on lower number ports for these default applications. So we're going to say 3000. And that's usually the convention for it. When you're developing a Node.js app and testing it out, you use port 3000. So like optionally in most of these URLs, you can say google.com:3000. Or 3000 is not going to work for Google. But if they were running an application on port 3000, you would be able to connect to it. And so in this case, we're saying we're going to listen on port 3000 for our application. So I have a question right over there.
I noticed that you're not using semicolons at the end of the lines. Is Node forgiving of that, or?
Yeah, so the question was, I'm not using semicolons. And here I am. I'm not using semicolons. Is Node forgiving of that? And actually, yes, Node is very forgiving. Node actually automatically inserts, or JavaScript in general, automatically inserts semicolons in your code. My personal preference, there's a lot of debates on whether or not semicolons are good or bad in Node, or in JavaScript in general. My personal preference is to not use semicolons because I'm very lazy. And why put in semicolons if the language is automatically going to do it for you? I know some people really will hate on me for this, but I prefer not to use semicolons. Or even when I do use semicolons, like unless I'm using a linter, which is a piece of code that I can run to say, hey, you forgot the semicolon, right? Node's not going to complain, right? So then I end up with a mashup of like code that some of it has semicolons, some of it doesn't, and it's even harder to maintain. So yeah, this is pretty much our basic Node.js app. You might have noticed compared to the sample code, I've actually not included this function for app.listen. In Node, well, in Express, you don't need to. That's an optional parameter. So I'm just going to keep this code as simple as possible to run this. So we really just have how many lines of code? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines of code. And this is really all we need to do to get a basic application with Node.js up. Let me see if I can install Express now that. Huh. So I'm going to see if I can clear my cache with the Express. But anyway, so what all of you will be able to do, since you're able to install the dependencies, is you'll be able to say node server.js. And that's going to actually start running your server. So if you type in node server.js and press enter, for me it's not going to do anything because I don't have it set up properly. But for you, it should actually start running a server on localhost, which stands for your own machine. So if you go on the web, open up Safari, open up Chrome, and then you go to localhost:8000. For me, again, this is going to say error. But for you, or not 8000, for :3000. For you, this should actually say hello world. So go and try this out. And I think you should have your basic hello world. You should have Express set up for the first time. So I had a question over there.
Oh, never mind. I got it solved.
Cool. So raise your hand if you now see hello world in your web browser.
That's so cool.
Awesome. So I think in the first 30 minutes after us trying to install Express and all this, we've gotten working it, which is great. what will we do next? So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about Express and its architecture and how it's actually really, really minimal and how you can do a lot of different things just knowing a very few things about Express. So in the Express website, you'll see at one of the points it has an API reference. And you'll see on the API reference on the right-hand side, it talks about 5 things. It talks about the Express object. It talks about the application object. It talks about the request. It talks about the response. And it talks about the router. Let's go through all these 5 things and talk about what they mean and what you can use them for. The first thing that we have is the Express object. Remember, this API is, we include Express with var express equals to require express. And we create this app with express open close parentheses. There's a few other things that we can do with this. We're not going to talk about it today, but you can see there's actually, I think, one other thing, right? Under express, express.static.
Excuse me?
Besides that, there's 2 things, express.router. So for now, all we really need to know about the Express object is you can create your application with it. Besides that, we're good.
This is under API references, correct?
Yes, this is under API reference.
Thank you.
The second thing here is we have the application object. And the application object is what we use right over here when we said app.get/. And the application object, the request object, and the response objects are actually the 3 objects that you'll be using the most. So as long as you familiarize yourself with these 3 parts of the Express API, you're going to be golden. So what is the application object? The application object really stands for your web application. And again, your application object has a few different settings. You'll see it all on the right side. There's kind of a list of the different events that can happen. What we're going to be concerned with really is really the ones that allow us to set routes. So we are just using app.get. Let's see, which is app.get right here. So app.get is a method on the Express object or on the application object that takes a path and takes a callback. And actually, so these callbacks are Express event handlers or Express handlers, and they take what are called middleware functions. And so we'll talk about middleware in a second. But there's a few different types of these handlers. We have app.get. And what app.get really means is, when I submit a web request, like if I go type in google.com, this is what's called an HTTP, a GET request. When I do things like I submit a form, those are things called a POST request. So, again, I can take a look. I can go down, and there's app.post. And pretty much the exact same thing, except it takes handlers for POST requests. Also in HTTP, we have the different Htt methods. The other ones are used more for APIs, but we have things like app.delete, which is for HTTP delete requests. So you can see actually the Express API over here is actually, most of this application API is actually for handling the different types of HTTP requests that you might get inbound. You also have some global handler like app.all, which is basically like app.get and app.post and app.delete and all the other different HTTP methods. And you have stuff like app.use, which is for basically saying for everything, use this piece of middleware or use this handler. So as you can tell, the application API is actually very, very straightforward. Again, you're just saying like, hey, what sort of requests are going to come in, and what do we want to do with them? Then the other 2 APIs that you really want to familiarize yourself with are the request and the response objects. So remember, we had this get request to /, and we had the request and the response object. The request object basically contains information about every single piece of information about this request. When I go to google.com, my browser sends a request to the server. One thing that it says is, hey, I want to get the / route. But it also sends other pieces of data. And the request object really just has all of the pieces of data over here. And if we look on the right-hand side, you'll see there are things like the request.hostname, request.ip, request.original URL, request.query. You can just look through this list and see like what pieces of information are we going to get about this inbound request. And you can respond appropriately to these requests. So I'm going to skip mostly over the request object. The last thing that we have is the response object. Remember, if I go to google.com, it's going to respond with a web page. So the response object really allows us to do things like set different headers, set different other pieces of information about the response, and ultimately construct and send the response. So if it's a web page, we're going to say, hey, put in this HTML in the response and fire it off. For others, we'll say, hey, we'll put in this JSON and fire it off. For others, we might even just say, hey, like I don't know, let's just not even respond to this response. So here you can see, for my response object, I'm saying response.send the string of hello world. And for all of you that were able to install, get Express up and running, you saw in the web browser that you actually got it to say hello world, which is awesome. So let's see if nope, not able to get Express installed today. All right, so we have this. The last thing that you really need to know and understand, and with these four, I think these four pieces of information, you can really start reasoning through and understanding Express web applications really well. I'll write down these four. The first thing is, again, the application object. The second thing is the request object. Third thing is the response object. If you understand these three things, you're pretty much golden. The last thing that you really need to understand is now the response handlers, these functions that we're passing into these handlers, and these functions are actually called middleware. And in Express, the philosophy here is everything is middleware. And I think most of you will be asking, what the heck is middleware? What does this even mean? And what middleware really means is it's a function that takes in a request, takes in a response, optionally takes in this object called next. And so in JavaScript, basically, if I ignore this next parameter, if I don't even put it in, it's just going to ignore it for me. It doesn't really care that there's a mismatch between like what Express is trying to send me and what I have. But actually, all Express middleware is actually a function with three things: request, response, and next. And basically, what this next thing is, so what this middleware does is it takes in a request, does some stuff to this request, and optionally passes it on. So if you can think of, like a request in Express, we have an incoming request. So we have an incoming request, and this basically goes through middleware. This goes to middleware. This goes through middleware, and then finally at the end, hopefully at the end, we'll respond with something. So what middleware just means is it takes in a request, it takes in a response, and then it continues along. So in Express, everything is middleware, which means everything is this function that takes in a request, that takes in a response, that takes in a next. And the middleware can decide, hey, like, should I continue processing this request? Should I send it out? And at the end of the middleware, basically, what we have to decide is, if we feel like, hey, we're good, we can just respond, right? Here we're saying response.send. But if we're not good, we actually, instead of saying response.send, we'll say next. And what this does is it tells Express, hey, we're done, but we have no idea what to do with this request. We'll pass this on. So I know this sounds like a lot. And middleware, I think, is like the trickiest part of Express to really understand. But let me go back up here, and we can start thinking about what this middleware is actually doing. Right? So let's say if I say app.get slash, or actually let's say app.use function rec res next. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying app.use this middleware for all of my routes. See, if I don't provide like a route, it's going to say use this for everything. So when a request comes in, so we have an incoming request, Express is going to say, hey, the first thing that I see here is app.use. That means I should put all of my requests into here. So app.use, I'm going to call this function with rec, res, and next. So this function is going to do some stuff. Maybe I'll say like rec dot, maybe I'll change some data about the request. Maybe I'll add some data to the request. Maybe I'll say rec.user equals to Edward, and I'll say next. So what happens is Express says, hey, I have a request. Now I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to use this this middleware because this matches all of my requests. So what this says to do is I'm going to add the string called Edward to my request object, and I'm going to go to the next thing. So this next thing passes the control back from the function back to Express. And now Express is like, OK, well, I have this request, and now I want to send it off to my next piece of middleware. My next piece of middleware is this app.get slash. And hey, this is a request for slash, so I'm going to send it over here. And so I'm going to call this function. And this function, we're going to say, we can do things. Instead of saying rec.send hello world, we can say res.send rec.user. And if we do that, then it's going to, and we restart our application, it will say Edward. So basically, being able to chain all of these middleware functions allows us to do really, really cool stuff and really build really complex applications with just these simple behaviors, right? Because at the beginning, I might do stuff like, OK, check if this user is logged in. If they're logged in, then we'll pass it on to the next handler. If not, let's redirect them to the logout function or the logged out page or the login page. I can do stuff like check for this header or check for I can add logic based on this. But again, I think with these four basic principles of Express, you can start building and reasoning through these really complex web applications.
How does the next determine which other function to go to? Is it just the one that just to the function?
Yeah. So the question was, how does next determine what function to go to? And so the answer is Express literally just goes through each one of these functions that you do in order and checks for these conditions. So if I say over here, app.get slash login function rec res, right? So if I have a request coming in for just the slash route, it's going to come in. It's going to say, OK, I'm going to use this middleware, so I'm going to run this for every request. OK, it's calling next, so I'm going to check for the next middleware. Well, the next thing is it's a handler for slash login, for get request on slash login. This does not match the request that I got, so I'm going to go to the next one. This one is a handler for slash, and that matches the request that I got, so I'm going to run this function. And this function, we're going to say res.send rec.user. So pretty much, Express just goes down the line one by one by one, checks the conditions that you have for each handler, and runs them if you have it. If you don't include next at the end of this, then it's not going to continue down the line. But it's a very interesting sort of design pattern here that allows you to chain things and just continue going down one by one.
Using Express, you have to be kind of mindful of what functions are taking what event handlers and the order.
Exactly. So the question is, does order matter in Express? And yes, you do have to be mindful of order. So for instance, sometimes at the beginning of an application, people will have some middleware to process the input, and then normalize the input and validate the input, so that whether or not someone's posting JSON or any other sort of data type, XML or whatever, it's going to normalize it. So later on, you don't have to say, oh, if this is XML, do this. If this is JSON, do that. If this is whatever, because you'll do that all at the beginning. Yeah. Another question right here.
Is this a big if-else chain?
It's not really a big if-else chain. This is more.
looking for a request first, and it checks what matches that request, and it keeps going down that chain.
Yes,
So you stop saying next.
exactly. So yeah, Express basically keeps going down the chain, checks for each condition, and then stops when you stop saying next. So, of course, if it doesn't have match this condition, it's not going to run it at all. So you don't have to have the next there. Another question.
Why does it matter if you pass it next or not?
So sorry, what was the question?
So if you don't pass it the next object as part of the function, you can't call it, or is it already predefined?
The question is, if you don't pass the next object, can you call it? And the answer is no. So Express always will send these three parameters: request, res, response, and next to your handlers. But in JavaScript, it's optional to actually take in all of those parameters. So if I didn't even want any of these objects, I can just use an empty function, and it will still get called. It's just those objects won't be available to me. So usually the idea is if you have a middleware that passes on the control of the request, you'll include the next. If not, you'll just use request and response. So then it's easier to reason about and scroll through your stuff. So OK, let's continue on, because I think we've talked a lot about the architecture of Express. And I think this gives you a really good way to reason about and think about how are you going to build an Express application, and how are you going to structure it. Next off, what we're going to do is we're going to actually start looking at this tutorial that I wrote. And I know we kind of went a little over time with the internet issues at the beginning. So we're not really going to be able to dive very deep into this tutorial. But yeah, if you search on Google for build an API for your mobile apps, or build an API for your mobile app, it should be the first one that's not an ad. So you'll see it's from stormpath.com, build a REST API for your mobile apps. And so this is going to talk a little bit more about building a REST API and plugging in authentication and so on and so forth. But what I'm going to show you in the next 10 minutes is really just a very basic, how do we set up a API endpoint, and then how do we call it and test it for ourselves as well. So in that tutorial, it's really about building a REST API for a mobile application or a web application that you might use to compete with Evernote or something like that, where you would build this application where you can type in, log in, type in some notes that you want to save, press the save button, and it gets saved to the server that you have running in this API. So the most basic thing that we're going to do in that application is we're going to add an endpoint called /notes. Right? So if we say app.get /notes, we can, over here, we can say res.json notes : here are the notes we've saved. So if you save this, rerun this. So you have to go back into terminal, press Control-C, not the command button, but the control button. Press Control-C and run this again. And if you issue a GET request to /notes, you'll actually be able to see a JSON file, pretty much with what we've typed in over here. So later on in the tutorial, and I know there's some free time later on today that you can work on this. I'll be over here at HackingEDU, so you can either find me at the booth, or I might be in the room where you'll be working on these projects. But you can always help me, ask me for help later on in the tutorial. But in this portion, right? So we're going to say here are the notes that we've saved, and what we can do is we can use this tool called Postman to actually test and check out our notes. So this wasn't in the starting, but later on you'll probably want to download this. There's this tool called Postman. It's really cool. And basically it's almost like a web browser, like Google Chrome or Firefox or Safari or IE, but it's specifically for checking out and viewing different APIs. So I already have a copy of Postman up and running on my system. And what you can see over here, I actually have, let's see. OK, so I'm not going to be able to issue a request to my own server because of my internet issues. But what I can do, you can see here, it's actually going to allow me to, Postman is a great tool to allow me to go and build an API service, or I mean to make requests in API service that I'm doing. So you can see in this first menu up at the top left-hand side, I can issue like, you don't have to follow along over here, but you can issue like get requests, post requests, the delete request that we were talking about. You can send different headers or so on and so forth. And you can actually, you can send all of these different values. And if I send them, I can get responses. So if you send a GET request, and you can leave the GET right there, and we say localhost :3000 / I think notes. We send this. For me, it's going to say couldn't get any response. Again, my API is not quite up and running. But for you, you should actually be able to see the JSON for the notes that you have. So you can test this out later. But I guess the general idea of what you'll continue building to start building out your REST API is, we've gotten pretty far, which we've actually gotten our first endpoint up. We have a / endpoint, which just like returns some text. But we have a /notes endpoint that now returns some JSON that allows us to communicate with a mobile app or another server, or format our data in a way that another whatever can start consuming that data. And so with that, then we'll be able. The next thing that we'll have to do is add like registration and user management, so that we can actually save data and save it to a specific user, and persist this data. But after you got all of that, we'll read some of the data from the request object, so on and so forth. But after all that, pretty much, it's not that many more steps from what we've gotten to today. Pretty much, you'll actually have your first application that's going to be able to, take in data that someone's sending to your server, save it, and then respond to it when requested. So hopefully, this was a good introduction to Node.js. As I said, this is the rest of this is written in a tutorial online. So definitely, I would highly encourage you to go on the website, take a look at the tutorial, start following through. And now that you have a basic introduction of how Express works, I think you'll be able to follow through and really understand like what you're doing at each step, and get the rest of this API built out. Besides that, you can always come up to our table, ask me if you have any questions, or you can tweet at me. My Twitter handle is just Edward Starcraft. So at Edward Starcraft on Twitter. But besides that, do you all have any other questions about Express, or where to go on from here, or anything else? We're good?
All right, guys, can we thank Stormpath and Edward?